I'm Tara Bentley, and I'm the Executive Director for the Indiana Association of Home Educators, otherwise known as the IAHE.
Hi, I'm Cindy Briggs. I'm a homeschool mom and a volunteer with IAHE.
We're here bringing you this podcast to share with you a lot of great information about homeschooling here in Indiana. This will be a place to learn about homeschooling, find the support you need, all in the Hoosier State.
Each week, we're going to focus on a different topic in the homeschool world. We'll bring you special guests and information that's going to help you on your homeschool journey. So let's get started.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to this episode of Homeschool Indiana, the podcast. My name is Tara Bentley, and today Cindy is not with me. I have another one of our amazing team members, Kyleen Varner. Kyleen, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Tara, thanks so much for having me.
You have been a part of our team for a long time. So many people who are a part of any of our social media groups probably knows your name because you do also lead our social media team and you do a great job there. And we're so grateful for all that you do, providing great answers across Facebook. That's a crazy volunteer job.
I appreciate that. Yes, it can be entertaining to say the least.
Yes, but more importantly, you are here with me today because you also serve as our legislative liaison, and that's a role you took on a couple years ago. You're a big part of what we do to protect homeschool freedom here in Indiana, and for that piece, I am even more excessively grateful to you and your entire family, actually.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's funny, this is never a role that I thought I would be in. It's never a space I saw myself in. And for our family, same thing. You know, Brian never saw himself as a bill reader, let alone the lead bill reader. My children never thought that they would be drugged down to the state house, you know, against their will, essentially, to be at Capitol Day and serving alongside their parents. But especially this last Capitol Day, they were pretty excited because they knew where things were and they wanted to go explore on their own. So I think they're not coming begrudgingly now.
Oh, that's great. So let's share with people. So if you are a new homeschooler, or maybe you're not even brand new, but maybe you don't know that we actually have two state organizations here. We are sister organizations. So IAHE is our main organization. It's been around since 1983. But in 2015, we realized that the threats against homeschool freedom were growing and our sister organization was formed, IAHE Action. And if you thought IAHE was hard enough to say, let's just make it even harder, right?
So many vowels.
Yes. So why don't you share with everybody more about Action and what it does?
Absolutely. Thanks for that. So IAHE Action is a 501c4, and our goal is to influence the legislative process for the good of homeschooling and parental freedoms. We do that by having really good, gentle, kind interactions with our legislators here in the state and on the national level.
Yeah, so I think many people, you know, it's all new territory if it's not something you've ever been a part of, but 501c3s, which is what IHE is, can be influential in the process. They can do some advocacy, but by forming an organization that is a 501c4, basically we expand our capacity to protect freedom.
Absolutely. And when I go to the State House, I go as the C4 and also identify myself as being the liaison between the C3 and the C4, just so that I'm clear. I'm not going bearing gifts or anything like that. I always go in the middle of a school day. I've come from schooling my kids. So I come in, of course, in my professional attire and my glasses. I'm there to speak to them, not yell at them. A lot of people do that, and they think that somehow that's going to influence people and make friends. It influences them, but not in the way they want. So when we are there as the face of C4.
And I think that one of the things that impacts these conversations a lot in going to Indianapolis and the State House is that, you know, volunteers do this work in our organization. You are a homeschool mom.
Absolutely.
who is there because you care about your family and your freedom.
Absolutely. And I have this really interesting situation where I have 3 children. They are currently 12, 14, and 15. I joke that we were on the 2-year plan, and for us, that meant 1 kid every 2 years. But we did not pray very specifically. This is our prayer, our lesson in being steadfast and diligent in our prayers and being very specific, because we ended up with all of our kids in about 2.5 years. So every year I end up with stair steps. So this year we will have let's see, 13, 14, 15 for about 2.5 months before they turn 13, 14, 16. And then a month or so later, 13, 15, 16. So we do joke, and yes, our life is very full and very busy, but our homeschooling journey actually started because my oldest daughter, we could tell that this child was gifted in terms of academics. And I say that, and every person thinks that their little cherub is so smart and is so gifted, right? But the child is 18 months old, and she's like, Mama, look at this decagon. This color is chartreuse. Just all these random things. Wow. But how does an 18-month-old know that, and so that started our foray into homeschooling. And then our youngest guy is a special learner. And so when I go in and I talk with these legislators, I'm able to say, like, listen, I'm coming to you with this gamut of the spectrum in terms of my kids and their abilities and us tailoring these educational needs for them. And so I'm not ignorant of what our special needs families can go through. Certainly we all go through different levels, but then also what our gifted families go through as well with their students.
Right. So, and as someone whose children are 7 years apart, my hat is off to you. Totally different experiences.
I don't know. I think you had the right idea.
Well, let's start off with something. So we love our friends on the national level, but we do think it's really important for people to understand. Many homeschoolers are familiar with the national organization, HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and we love them. And they're very, they're trusted partners with us. They're a great resource for us. But I think a lot of families believe that they're here in Indiana, or they have some presence here in Indiana, but they're not. They're in Virginia, and IAHE and IAHE Action together, we are the ones here in Indiana building relationships with legislators that keep homeschooling free.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important. There is no magical fairy who is keeping an eye on homeschool legislation here in the state. And a lot of us want to believe that because we're in the trenches. We're in the trenches right now, homeschooling our kids. I was just having this conversation with some friends the other day. They have little kids who are learning how to read and how to write, and my kids are not at that stage anymore. And so I'm now the one who has taken that baton and is going down to the State House. And I know that with our friends at HSLDA that they do have to do some state-specific work for the states that don't have people doing that work for them. For a variety of reasons, legislative work can be really intimidating. But HSLDA does not serve Indiana in that way because IAHE and Action are here to fill in that gap. And we have a long record of success in maintaining good relationships with our legislators here in the state.
And it is really important. And this is not at all to disparage our friends because, again, we love, we honor, we respect them, but they're watching 50 states. They're watching globally. And so when it comes to Indiana, we're on top of it. We're watching it. And I think that one of the things, to kind of go to what you said, there are two different ways that homeschool families lose their freedom. I mean, you could break it down to a lot of different ways, but let's say it is either a direct attack on our freedom or something that we refer to as unintended consequences. So those are the things that probably parents are not as aware of, but they're just as important. So what are some things that we've dealt with over the past couple years that could have resulted in unintended consequences?
That's a great question. So there are a couple of different categories that I think of when we talk about these unintended consequences. I'll go with the least obvious one first. So one of the least obvious things that we saw was in the 2021 legislative session, there was a Department of Child and Family Services bill that was put out that said that DCS could interview a child at any point in time with or without a parent's knowledge or consent. And that included all children.
Right.
All children. So to keep that in perspective, that would mean that DCS could come to my house with or without my knowledge or consent and interview my children who were homeschooling. And that is a breach of a First Amendment right. And so we went to the legislative group at that time who was overseeing that committee. And we said, you don't get to have unwarranted access to our homes. What are you thinking? And so during that committee, there was thankfully an amendment that was brought forth, and they said, this takes care of the homeschoolers. And so we have, again, that affirmation that while there is no formal definition of homeschooling here in the state, we have a functional definition, and that is non-accredited, non-public that has less than one employee. So that's where we fall. That's kind of the least thing that we tend to think about. When we go for the more obvious things that infringe upon our freedoms and our ability to homeschool our children the way we see fit, we start to think about school funding and all of the laws and regulations that come with that. And what we can say definitively across time and states is that when we have ESA legislation come in, inevitably within the first 1 to 3 years after that program has taken hold, homeschoolers at large will be wrapped up in the regulation that comes. I think one of our first examples really was Alberta, Canada. And I know that people are saying, but that's not the US, Kyleen, stop it. And you would be right, but it is a democratic government here in North America. And so we can look at history and we can learn what has happened there. And they came in the first year and they said, hey guys, we're going to offer money, and whoever wants to take it can take it, and who doesn't have to. And everybody went, okay, that sounds fine, because you don't want to be the one to tell families, no, you can't take this money. And the very next year, the government came back and said, if you don't take the government money, your diplomas are no longer valid. And so then you put these families who had not necessarily been supportive, but had not been openly against not giving funding. Now they were swept up in that. And no matter what they wanted to do, if they wanted their kids to have a valid diploma, they were going to have to take that money. It hasn't gotten that drastic, I would say, here in the United States, but we can definitely see where things are going. We can look at our friends in West Virginia and Tennessee most recently. We can look at Idaho. We can look at North Carolina. And we can say these are states that have had ESA legislation passed. And then again, within that 1 to 3 year mark, you're looking at all the eligibility requirements coming off. Everybody gets to have the funding, and everybody who does is automatically swept up in state testing, things like portfolio reviews, curriculum reviews, et cetera.
And I think it's really important. I mean, obviously, homeschooling has never been more popular. I mean,
right.
in modern times, home education has never seen larger numbers, but there's also been, obviously an expansion of all kinds of educational options. And so what we're also seeing is a scrambling to keep up with all those options. And it's obviously one of those things that we watch very carefully, that we don't get swept up in. And when we talk about school choice, I think it's really important. Obviously, this is audio, but when we're talking about school choice, there's this generic phrase, school choice, and we can say that home education is the epitome of school choice. It is an option, and we always have choice, but school choice, capital S, capital C, really represents more of a movement and a lobbying effort to break the monopoly of public education and take the funding away, take it with them. We're talking about backpack bills, money that follows the child. These are very different things. And so when we talk about that, it's not that we're anti-choice. We are not anti-choice.
Not at all.
But we do not like to see funding that families can get lured into. And I even think about today, because again, on our social media channel, we have families that reach out to us who say, "Way, I was lured into this program. I was promised XYZ. And instead, what I got was something that, restricted my child, restricted my freedom, didn't give me all the things." I mean, just this morning, we're having that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think that that's really important and something that is really worth highlighting here. So in general, when we say school choice, we mean common noun, right? Little s, little c. But as you point out, there is the school choice organization, and that organization receives millions of dollars from donors who help support pushing this agenda of moving children away from public schools and taking the funding with them. So this obviously is not a podcast about the public schools and all that is or isn't going on within a publicly funded system. But it's really important to point out here that when we talk about money following children, we don't talk about the laws and the regulations following those same children, and they always do, always.
Right.
Just yesterday, I had someone reach out to me and ask about laws that now state accredited non-public schools have to follow simply because they take the funding. And it's good and right for those laws to come into play because taxpayers fund those kids. And when you have taxpayer funding, you 100% need to have and should have taxpayer accountability. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And then the last thing I'll say about school choice, well, two things, I lied, two things. One of them is that, you know, there are school choice organizations who go to the State House and they say, oh yeah, we speak for the homeschoolers. And they don't. So oftentimes, well-meaning legislators who believe they have the backing of the homeschool community will put a bill forward, and the rest of us are going, what are you talking about? No, thank you. We don't like to have that. No, thank you. And so I feel bad for the legislators in those situations because they think they've done their due diligence, right? Like they're talking with these organizations who say that they support the homeschoolers. And especially when you've got newer legislators coming in, they just don't know better. And so a lot of the work that we do is familiarizing them with us, who we really are homeschoolers here in the state, and we can speak firsthand about that. The other thing I want to say about school choice, and now I'm talking common noun, is when the only choice we have is government funded choice, that isn't choice.
Right.
So a lot of the work we do is to maintain the freedom of choice, to educate our children free of the government funding and the excessive laws that come with it.
Right. And so, okay, so let's just say it, no matter when you're listening to this, just want to let you know, we're recording this in March of 2024, and we are less than 1 week from our legislative session coming to an end. And so we're going to talk about some current bills from this session, but it is one of those rare days in March I'm just going to share because it's like 70 degrees, and in my office, I'm currently being attacked by ladybugs. So I don't know about anybody else, but this is the fun of making sure I don't get hit in the head with a ladybug. But with a short session, Kyleen, we were still.
I might laugh out loud at that, just so you know, if I watch you get hit in the head.
Because we're watching each other on Zoom, even though we're just recording the podcast. But so with a short session, typically we don't see quite as many crazy things because there's no budget, right? There's no open box of money that people are fighting for, especially in the education space, because education takes up the majority of the state budget. So this being a short session, Kyleen's going to share with us a lot of what we did watch, what we did fight, and obviously what we're potentially up for next year with the long session and a budget bill. So what kind of bills did we watch and fight and monitor this year here in 2024?
Sure. So short sessions happen on even years. And what a short session means is it's really just supposed to be an emergency session. So at the bottom of every bill, you will see in bold black writing, an emergency is declared for this act. And so what that does is it slides it into whatever budget line item that is needed to and makes the appropriate changes to the law so that that emergency can in fact be enacted. And generally speaking, you would expect a short session to be much less eventful. You don't really expect it to be as fast and furious as a budget year. Budget years happen on odd years, and lots of things are going on in a budget year. There's lots of talks going on, lots of people grabbing for that money because, again, education has the largest piece of the budget pie here in Indiana. So of course it makes Indiana really attractive to all these different educational options. So what we've noticed just historically, I would say the last 3 to 5 years, so not what I would say incredibly longitudinal, but enough that we can get this idea of what is happening, is we are seeing an increased number of DCS bills, and specifically in relation to what we term as children in need of services, or a child in need of services, and we abbreviate that as CHINS. So we have the Cox case that came out a few years back where parents unlawfully had their child taken out of their home. I really encourage your readers to go out and read that case, be up to date on what's going on with it, because it is certainly influencing laws that we are seeing today with what DCS can and cannot do to children that are in its custody. So these are things like taking a child to get immunizations against the parent's will or not, getting the parent's involvement or not, hair care treatments, things like this. And people might say, well, why is a homeschooling organization watching that? And the reality is that's a parental right. And so a large part of what we do is also watching and defending parental rights, and in that realm, defending a parental right to homeschool. And unfortunately, we do have some well-meaning neighbors, some well-meaning family members who learn that a family is homeschooling their children. They firmly believe that if you're home, you're being neglected. And so they call DCS and they report the family for homeschooling. We had this happen just a few weeks ago where a family reached out and said, my family members were in town, they hung out with my child, and DCS was here on Monday. Thankfully, the case was dismissed and we didn't have to go any further with that. We are also seeing an increase in parental time laws. So these are situations where the parents are not married or are going through a divorce, and the law is having to kind of siphon out who gets what time and when. I think that's very interesting. The law is specific in some ways about certain subjects, but then is ambiguous in other subjects. There's a lot of education law happening in Indiana and across the nation right now. There's a lot of hype on science of reading. I agree with that. I believe that children should be taught phonics as an Orton Gillingham tutor. I am behind that 100%. I would love to see all of our kids read beyond, the standard acceptable range. I would love to see all of our kids at the 80th or higher percentiles for reading. So we're seeing a lot of SOR, that science of reading language. We're also seeing truancy language. We know that with COVID, a lot of kids were home for various things. It's where we saw our largest growth in homeschooling, right? In the modern age. We are seeing truancy bills come through. We're seeing these truancy bills morph. What I thought was really interesting this year was the truancy bill that was put forth included all school types with the exception of us, the non-accredited non-pubs, less than one employee. And so as that bill moved through the chambers, it was then stripped away to include public schools and charter schools. I think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that bill in particular, that language, as the years go on. What other publicly funded schools are going to be swept into that. Also really interesting this year, stuff regarding pesticide usage. Never before did I think that homeschoolers might be included in a law about pesticides, but sure enough, the Office of the State Chemist came out with a bill, SB 224. I'm wrong, I'm sorry, SB 216. It's right, SB 224 is right below that. So 216 came out, and I really liked the language in this bill simply because it's meant to protect children in all school environments against pesticide usage. I really like that language. As a biologist, that makes me happy because I know that we're trying to protect growing bodies. And the one exception that was put in there was a homeschool, right? A non-accredited, non-pub, less than one employee. And you can say, well, Kyleen, you really like that language because as a biologist, you know that those chemicals can harm growing bodies, and you're not wrong. But as a homeschool, my home is where that happens. So if I've got some naughty weeds that I'm trying to get rid of, like a Canadian thistle, I might deem it appropriate to use a little bit of a pesticide, not a pesticide, but an herbicide on that to get rid of that. So language like that, I did appreciate. We saw some changes in employment of minors this year. Again, this is a national outpouring from the Republican Party, changing work hours of minors. I'm waiting to see how this one comes through the governor's desk, simply because the majority of the restrictions were removed for 16 and 17-year-old aged minors. There were a few that were changed for 14-year-olds, but the way the code is currently modified is that it looks like 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds were able to work until 7 p.m. through 7 a.m. on school days, but the weekend was fair game. Now that weekend language is removed, that school day language is removed. So it looks like even on the weekends, they're required to stay within that 7 p.m., 7 a.m. language. So I'll be interested to see how that works out. One of the biggest things we saw both in the House and the Senate was a move away from days of instruction to minutes of instruction. So I can assure you there were several conversations going on about the undue harm and undue burden that places on a homeschooler. So we acknowledge that when kids are in a brick and mortar building, there's a lot of time that is downtime, right? There's a lot of like in the hallway, transitioning, going to the potty, getting a drink of water. We homeschoolers don't have that. We can cover a lot of ground in a lot less time. So it would effectively double our instructional days in order to achieve those minutes of instruction that your local brick and mortar is obtaining easily, because the kids are already there and they're looking at these very, very long days of instruction. And in those cases, the legislators simply, they didn't mean us any harm. They weren't thinking about the impact on us, right?
Right.
So I'm really grateful that we were able to have those really open and honest conversations where they were listening to our concerns and then said, oh my goodness, I didn't think about that. Yeah, for sure. That would be a problem for you all. Finally, the biggest push across the nation and here in our state is for ESA and 100% funding of school choice, which means that you will not have an option to be free of the government. So we had several of those bills this year. What we're looking at heading into the school year 2024-2025 is that eligibility requirements for siblings of kids with disabilities will be dropped and they will be allowed to be in that program. Curricular materials have been approved, but again, that's going to be the treasurer's office determining what is a curricular material and what is not. In gearing up for the 2025 session, what we as a homeschool group need to be focused on, again, this idea of instructional minutes versus an instructional day. We need to be vigilant about that. And then also this idea of 100% school choice. There are school choice lobbying organizations who have been very clear that they are coming for the remainder 3%, and those are their words. There are currently about 3% of the students here in the state of Indiana that are not qualified for government funding for a variety of reasons, income, homeschooling, whatever that looks like. And so those organizations have made it clear that they have every desire to envelop us in that government funding.
Right. And I think what's really important, and we can't say this often enough, is that for so many people, including legislators, including these lobbyists, they look at the word homeschooling and they view it as a generic term. And I'm just going to say, right, like we know it's not a generic term. We also know nobody cares about the definition as much as us. No one, because we're looking further down the road. But I'm just going to tell you, as someone who is kind of obsessed with Diet Coke, if I walk into a restaurant and I ask for Diet Coke, guess what I mean? I mean, I want a Diet Coke. And so I'm not going to take a Diet Pepsi. But there are some things that really matter. And this is,
I got to be honest. I feel like it tastes like Windex, but that's just me. I have never had a drink of Windex, but if I did, that's to me what it would taste like. So I'm with you.
Yeah.
If I asked for a Diet Coke and I was given Windex, I would not be pleased. I just wouldn't.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. And I've had some questions about, Kyleen, do you think that we need to go for a definition? And we talk about this every year as an organization. We sit down as a team and we talk about, do we need to do this? And we have these open conversations with our legislators as well, that we're not just making these decisions blindly on, do we go for a definition? Do we not? And the question is always, is it doing its job? is the current status doing its job? And what are the unintended consequences of doing something different, right?
Right.
So I hear these stories, and you were around for this. I wasn't. So I just tell the story secondhand of Senator Cruz saying, this is the book, and showing the huge, like 2 to 3 inch book of public school laws that these publicly funded schools have to follow. And him saying, you have to stay out of the book, stay out of the book.
Yeah, I was there. It was very powerful. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And his, the people who have followed behind him, if you don't know who Senator Cruz is, he was the chair of the Senate Education Committee, and a homeschool dad. And so he was always really emphasizing, and many other legislators who have come before him, stay out of the book. And so our definition as a non-public, non-accredited with less than one employee. And honestly, with less than one employee is a piece of code is kind of separated, and most people didn't even refer to it. Like it wasn't even a thing until, pre-pandemic, when we realized, when legislators were telling us, this is how we remove you from law. This is how we remove you from code. So to some people, like that, this may be the first time they're hearing those pieces put together, but it really matters.
It absolutely does. And to your point, I don't think it mattered until after the pandemic, in truth. That piece of code was there to say that we didn't have to have background checks to school our kids at home. All the other schools do. Every school, even those non-accredited non-pubs that have at least one employee, they're all required by law to adhere to fire safety code, background checks, all these things. And we don't, because we're in our own homes with our own kids. And so now we're watching that language, the non-accredited, non-public, less than one employee. We're showing that in the code multiple times now, right? So we're seeing it with that state chemist office, the Office of the State Chemist. We're seeing it in that language. We're seeing it in ESA language. We're seeing it in the new bill that comes out with the HSE language that says if we as parents, administrators of a non-accredited non-pub less than one employee want our kids to take the HSE, that's HB 1243. Lots of letters flying around here, guys. So in HB 1243, and when I say HB, I mean House Bill, SB means Senate Bill. So HB 1243, we see this language come in that says that parents are able, if they're running a homeschool, to have their child take the HSE if that's what they choose to do. And this is one of those rare occasions. I actually got the legislators to chuckle a little bit on the floor during testimony, because it was one of the few occasions that I have been able to go in and testify in favor of having that language in a bill, right? So people can say, no, we want to be non-accredited non-pub. Don't give us that limitation. But the reality is everyone is coming under more and more and more and more regulation. And so that distinction keeps us separate from everyone else.
Right. And it was also one of the things that allowed us to not have to go to the local public school to get work permits for our team.
Absolutely.
So we see it over and over again. So, okay, so let's talk about just a couple of other things I want to follow up. So the pillars of homeschool freedom, you talked about why we watch certain bills, and it's because of parental rights. So again, we don't always see bills coming at us, directly, but we see attacks on these two pillars. And what are those two pillars?
Right. So first and foremost, the God-given right to address the education of our children in the manner that we see fit. And we believe in that right for every parent of every student, whether you are a homeschooling parent, whether you're in a private school, a public school, you have the right by God to educate your child the way you see fit. And then finally, we're going to go to just those pillars of our amendment rights and our bills of rights and saying, we have a right to be independent of the government. We see cases like this in Yoder v. Wisconsin. We see it in Pierce versus Society of Sisters. The Supreme Court has continued to argue these pillars over and over and over again, that we as parents, not the state, and I think that is super important to add in there, the state does not have the ability to direct the upbringing of the child. We have Supreme Court cases that actually say the child is not a mere creature of the state. I love the story of Van Tyler, that she carried around just that little portion with her to
Right.
help defend, if she was ever taken into custody, to help her defend her stand, that she as a parent had the right to direct the upbringing and education of her child.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the last things I want to talk about is that protecting freedom doesn't just happen in during the legislative session. So Kyleen, you also spend a lot of time throughout the rest of the year, basically dispelling untruth wherever it occurs. I mean, I'll call you Superwoman, but
No, I'm not worthy of that.
well, when an employer contacts or tells, someone who's applying for a job, I need to see your homeschool diploma, or show me
Sure.
in code where this word homeschool appears and how did you meet it? Or we have people who need work permits, or they have trouble getting into college because the college all of a sudden starts asking for something above and beyond for a homeschool student. You very
Sure.
kindly and sweetly and directly bring truth to these situations and call them up or send them an email and educate them on the law.
Absolutely. So let me just start this by saying there are some people that heard that and they're like, oh my goodness, I could never do that. And let me just say, I am also that person. People don't often believe this, but I am an introvert and I really just want to be left alone. I don't want to have to call somebody and say in the nicest way possible, what do you think you're doing? That's so cute. Let's not do that. That's not actually what the law says. And so my first few times of interacting with schools, especially, I do a lot of phone calls to schools as parents are withdrawing their children to homeschool. And even just yesterday, we had someone reach out. They had their first grader in a private school, and they withdrew their child, and the private school required a form and said DOE requires it. They don't. The parent even said, no, that's not how this works. And the school continued to push. And when we see things like this, and this is where it's one of the bonuses of me also being with the social media crew, is that I see that stuff and they can pull me in pretty quickly. And it happens across all Facebook groups. It doesn't matter if it's an IAHE group or not. These people know that we will call and we will help defend them. And not in a situation where we're going to be mean or unkind. We're not. We're simply going to point them back to the law and say, you're asking a parent to fulfill something that they cannot do. They can't do X, Y, Z. Or, hey, college, you're requiring X, Y, Z of a homeschooler, but not of any other school child enrolling in your program. So that's actually discrimination. And those are really uncomfortable conversations to have, but they can be done in a kind way, in a generous way, and one that isn't accusatory.
Yes, and I will say, I think it has to be said is that we are a membership driven organization, but we don't ask if you're a
Absolutely.
member before we're going to go to bat for
Not
you.
at all.
We are also a Christian organization, but we don't ask. If you're having trouble,
Correct.
we are a Christian organization who, if you are having struggles, we're going to fight for you. We're going to fight for, getting into that college or whatever it is. And so it is a part of what we do to keep the entire homeschool community free here in Indiana.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, Tara. Thank you for that, because sometimes people will ask, well, I'm not a member. And I say, I didn't ask you if you're a member, right? Like this is for the greater good. This is defending your ability to homeschool and the work that you are doing or have done or will do now and for the future. I mean, my kids are obviously not old enough to be out of the house and married yet. I do have a rule. They cannot be 26 and living in my basement. That's my rule. But I want them to be able to have these freedoms as well too. And I want my neighbors to be able to educate their kids at home if that's what they want to do. I want to be able to defend that. And so when we talk to these people and I say, listen, I'm not going to charge you for it. In some of these situations, Tara, we work for days on. I can think of a case out of Allen County that we worked on for over a month. A month we worked on this case and finally got it resolved. unfortunately, we did have to bring in some lawyers. We did have to bring in some legislators to help with that situation. And if it is a legal issue, we want to be clear, we are not attorneys. We are not. We can point to the law and say, this is what the law says, but we cannot give legal advice. So if a family is ever in a situation where they need legal advice, we 100% of the time say, this is something that you need to have an attorney for, and we can make a recommendation. My first is always HSLDA. We have them for that reason, right? Like as
Right.
homeschooling parents, that's what they're there for. I have a few others that I can recommend, but they're usually my default. And I say, you need an attorney. And for those families who need attorneys, I cannot stress this enough. You must be in communication with those lawyers frequently, and you must do everything they ask you to do. Because if you don't, things can go sideways pretty quickly.
And I think it is important. Like we're sharing a lot of information here, and it's really
We
important.
are.
We're not fear mongering. And
Not
honestly,
at all.
98% of the time, there's no problem. Like I just made
Correct.
that number up, but I feel pretty confident, right?
It's pretty
98%.
accurate. Yeah. It's
Pretty
pretty
accurate.
accurate.
98% of us are never going to have an issue. And of those people who do have issues, the vast majority are still going to be situations where the root issue is miscommunication and misunderstanding.
Absolutely.
And that
Yeah.
is where you can help bring understanding and bring knowledge to the situation. Because people just, they're not, we're just not talking the same language. They're asking something of a family they don't legally have the right to, and it can usually be cleared up. And that means that in those, whatever number is left there of my imaginary numbers that I just made up, where a lawyer is needed. And so it is really
Absolutely.
important to, stay in communication with us. If you have an issue, reach out to us. And, when a lawyer is required, we're definitely going to send you that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, one of the things that we talk about as a team often is being winsome, being winsome and kind and loving in our words and our communication. And generally speaking, assuming the best of each other and anyone that we are working alongside. And that includes, those employers, that includes the
Right.
school system, that includes the college. We want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Will I say that I never get upset? No, I will not say that, because there are times where I'm just like, oh my goodness, you've had the truth shared with you and you are still being blind. Okay, time for the attorney, right? But for the most part, when a family reaches out, a lot of those situations feel emergent to them, and some of them are.
Right.
Some of them are absolutely emergent. Think about the young man who's trying to go into the military, and he has a recruiter who is not aware of the laws that were clarified in 1997 regarding military entrance, that there were no issues with homeschoolers, right? And getting the documentation together to help a young man and his mom navigate that, and speaking with their recruiters. And at the end of the day, if we can speak in loving kindness, there is such a better relationship that is built. And we have agencies calling us to ask these questions. We have school systems saying, hey, we're really sorry. We thought that we were operating within the law. We are not. Can you help us get better?
Right.
And I don't know about you, but I really appreciate those conversations.
Absolutely. And, it happens across all kinds of spheres. My mind goes back to years ago. Again, people want to check boxes. And I think this happens a lot.
Yeah.
We see this increasingly as employers want to utilize third parties to do like employment verification. And so
Yep.
the employer may be here in Indiana, but this third party verification company is probably in Florida. And so they're trying
Right.
to check a box that says, I've seen this homeschool diploma and who issued
Right.
it. And so we deal with that a lot. We dealt with that with, homeschool graduates who moved to Florida. And, so we're fighting for a family who doesn't even live here anymore.
Right.
And yet we're still going to be there to help protect freedom for Indiana families.
Absolutely. Yeah. I worked with this past summer, so it would have been the summer of 2023. My goodness, where does the time go?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I worked with a gentleman who was in his 30s, and he was a firefighter EMT, and he was moving fire stations. And they said to him, well, your mom can't possibly just print off your transcript and your diploma. And my response was, why not? Of course she can. Like,
Right.
and so, you know, in those cases, whoever the person is in that, you know, fire station, they're not trying to be ridiculous. They're not. In their mind, it seems ridiculous that a parent could have that kind of authority in their child's school. We've had it with colleges in Missouri, right? 36-year-old people who are trying to apply for colleges there. And the school saying, well, surely somebody has the authority to do this. Like, well, yes, the parent does. Well, you have the diploma. No, I don't. Our organization does not track that stuff because our laws don't require that. So all of that to say, it has really been a joy to walk alongside these families. I think my work in this realm really started in 2022, more or less, jumping in and helping these families. I might have done a little in 2021 with contacting schools because we were dealing with so much with COVID. But it has really been a joy to walk alongside these families, be an ear for them when the panic kind of sets in of different circumstances are happening, and then helping them find a solution that is good and right.
Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap it up. So we're grateful that you're a part of our team. I'm very grateful that you're here fighting for Indiana families. So, you know, we haven't really talked about membership at all here on the podcast. So, you know, we did mention it. Again, we're talking about the fact that we have two different organizations. So if you're here and you want to support our work with IAHE, you can certainly get a membership, get all the great perks that come with that, including a print magazine. And you can check out more on IAHE.net. And then both organizations really depend and are blessed by donations. So
absolutely.
IAHEaction.net is where you can support our legislative work through donations as well. So any final words, Kyleen?
I have about 1,000,001 things I want to say, but at the end of the day, Indiana is a wonderful state to homeschool in. We are truly blessed to have the laws we do. And I think as our parents navigate through this idea of homeschooling, many of you are just starting on your own journeys. Some of you are wrapping up your journeys and you're retiring. Good for you. I will look at that with wonder and awe and know that I will be there someday too. And for those of us that are there in the trenches, I just want to encourage you that the IAHE is here for you. It doesn't matter what your religious affiliation is. It doesn't matter how long you've been homeschooling or what that looks like for your family. We're here to help you. We are here to serve you, and we are here to protect homeschooling for the future generations, not just you now. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us with a question. If you feel awkward and you don't want to put that into social media, I totally understand that. Even sometimes people don't want to do an anonymous post. If you want to send me a PM, you're free to do that. My name again is Kyleen Varner, V as in Victor. People always go, oh, B as in Varner. I'm like, no, V as in Victor. So please know that you're free to do that. And if you ever have a question that you want to send through email, my email is KYLENE, V as in Victor, at IAHE.net.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for all of your efforts throughout the year. And I appreciate you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you. So we're going to drop this podcast next week, which will be conference week for us here in Indiana. So if you're catching us, conference week, if you're catching us on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, we hope you'll still join us. If you're hearing this afterwards, check out our website and look for future events. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. See ya.